I have written 412 extinction reports. Each one is a document of closure. A species name, rendered in Concord standard phonetics. A homeworld designation. A climate profile, a biological summary, a cultural précis if sufficient data survived the decline. And then the terminal section: cause of extinction, timeline of collapse, percentage of predicted trajectory achieved versus observed outcome. I sign them. I date them. I file them with the Office of Terminological Records on Vara Prime, and the species ceases to exist as a political entity and becomes instead a reference number in the archive of everything the galaxy has lost. My name is Salith Maran Vashari. I am a senior extinction analyst for the Concord Bureau of Species Trajectory, and I have been doing this work for 31 years. I am very good at it. This is not a boast. It is the kind of statement that becomes true through repetition, like erosion. I am good at identifying the markers: pre-extinction societal fragmentation, resource depletion curves, reproductive decline thresholds, technological stagnation windows. I can look at a species output across 4 generations and tell you, within a margin of 11 years, when the last viable population cluster will fall below replacement. I have done this 412 times, and I have been wrong twice. Both times I was early by less than a decade. The species in question were simply more stubborn than my models predicted, which is its own kind of tragedy. They lasted long enough to watch themselves fail, instead of simply vanishing in the dark. My work matters because the Concord uses it. Every species on the trajectory list is subject to triage allocation. Resources flow toward civilizations that can be preserved, and away from those whose numbers have crossed the terminal threshold. This is not cruelty, it is mathematics. There are 11 billion sapient beings in the Concord's administrative envelope, spread across 43 species, and every medical shipment, every atmospheric stabilizer, every genetic repair initiative sent to a dying world is one not sent to a living one. Someone has to draw the line. I draw the line. I have never once drawn it wrong. Until 6 days ago, when I landed on a world that should have been empty, opened my atmospheric sampler and heard children laughing. The assignment was routine. Directive 7-7-1 subsection Cathali, post-extinction verification survey of Sol 3. A marginal death world in an unremarkable yellow star system at the trailing edge of the Orion Spur. I had written the extinction report myself 11 years earlier. Report 389, Sol 3 dominant species, Homo sapiens, Class 4 death world origin, atmospheric toxicity variable, tectonic instability, severe. Predicted extinction window, 40 to 60 years following the Heron-Kesh asteroid redirect. The Heron-Kesh redirect was not an accident. I should say that now, because the file says it was, and the file is what I signed. 11 years ago, the Concord Trajectory Board reviewed Sol 3's species profile and determined that Homo sapiens was on a terminal path. Not imminently, their population was still growing, their technology still advancing, but the models were clear. A death world species with their particular combination of aggression, resource consumption, tribalism, and environmental instability had a median survival window of 400 years past industrialization. They were at 230. The curve was textbook. What made Sol 3 unusual was the speed of their weapons development. Most species at their stage have rudimentary orbital capability and basic nuclear arsenals. Humans had thermonuclear weapons, kinetic bombardment theory, and this is the part that made the board uncomfortable. They had already landed organisms on their nearest satellite and sent autonomous probes to the outer planets. They were, in the board's terminology, precociously lethal. A species that would likely destroy itself in 2 centuries but might in the interim become capable of reaching Concord space. The board elected to accelerate the timeline. They called it a natural event correction. Asteroid 2341-Heron-Kesh, a body large enough to trigger a Class 2 impact winter, was redirected from a safe transit orbit into a collision trajectory with Sol 3. The operation was handled by the Concord's Boundary Enforcement Division. I was not involved in the redirect itself. My role was simpler. I verified the trajectory models, confirmed the extinction timeline, and signed Report 389 certifying that Homo sapiens would not survive the impact winter beyond 18 months. I was thorough. I modeled their food production systems, their energy infrastructure, their genetic diversity under population bottleneck conditions. I accounted for their nuclear arsenals, their underground construction capability, their known bunker sites. The numbers were unambiguous. An 18-month impact winter at the severity we projected would collapse their agricultural base within 4 months. Civil order would follow within 2. The remaining population clusters, perhaps 40 million in the deepest bunkers, would exhaust stored calories by month 14 and begin terminal decline. By month 18, the last viable breeding populations would be below replacement threshold. By month 30, the world would be functionally sterile of sapient life. I signed the report. I filed it. I moved on to report 390. That was 11 years ago. 6 days ago, I landed on Sol 3 for the post-extinction verification survey. Stepped out of my shuttle onto a hillside in what my charts designated as a temperate zone of the northern continent, and looked down into a valley where 400 human beings were harvesting grain. I want to describe what I saw accurately, because accuracy has been the architecture of my life, and I can feel it leaving me. The valley was approximately 3 kilometers long and perhaps 800 meters wide, cut by a shallow river that had been dammed at 2 points with structures made of poured stone and salvaged metal. The fields on either side of the river were planted in alternating strips. A tall, golden cereal grain I could not immediately identify, a lower green crop with broad leaves, and rows of something dark and root-like that had been recently turned. The irrigation channels were hand-cut but precise, following the contour of the terrain with a regularity that suggested surveying instruments, or at minimum, a competent understanding of hydrology. There were structures, not ruins, structures that were being lived in. A cluster of perhaps 60 buildings spread along the river's eastern bank, constructed from a combination of pre-impact materials, steel beams, concrete slabs, polymer sheeting, and newer elements that appeared to be locally manufactured: timber framing, kiln-fired brick, glass panes, irregular but functional, set into window frames that had been sized and fitted with care. And people. 411 by my count over the first 3 hours of concealed observation. Men, women, children. The youngest I observed was perhaps 2 years old, carried on the hip of a woman who was simultaneously directing the operation of a hand-cranked grain separator. The oldest was a man with white hair and a prosthetic left leg, crude, mechanical, clearly post-impact fabrication, who was sitting on a stone wall repairing a fishing net, with movements so practiced his hands never paused even when he turned to speak to someone behind him. I sat in the long grass above the valley with my sampling equipment untouched beside me, and I watched them for 3 hours, and I could not make the numbers work. They should not have been there. Any of them. The impact winter should have killed them all. My models were built on 31 years of verified data from 412 extinction events across the Concorde's records. The caloric math alone was impossible. An 18-month impact winter at the projected severity would have eliminated all surface agriculture across the planet. The global temperature drop would have rendered even greenhouse cultivation non-viable without industrial energy inputs, and the electromagnetic pulse from the impact would have destroyed 70% of their electrical grid in the first week. The cascade was self-reinforcing. No grid, no heating, no refrigeration, no communication, no coordination. The bunker sites I had modeled could sustain their populations for 14 months on stored supplies. After that, there was nothing to emerge into. But here they were, harvesting grain, in a valley that should have been under 3 meters of ash-contaminated snow for the better part of 2 years. I ran the atmospheric sample. The air was clean. Not pre-impact clean. There were elevated particulate levels, trace heavy metals, a sulfur signature consistent with volcanic coactivity following a major impact event, but breathable, livable, the kind of atmosphere you find on a recovering world, not a dead one. I checked the soil, nitrogen depleted but functional. The grain in those fields was not growing in imported soil or artificial medium. It was growing in the ground, in ground that had been ash-covered tundra 11 years ago. They had brought the soil back. I don't know how to convey the impossibility of that sentence to someone outside my discipline. Soil recovery after a Class 2 impact winter is a geological process. It takes decades at minimum, centuries in most cases. The microbial ecosystems alone, the bacteria, the fungi, the nitrogen-fixing organisms that make agriculture possible, those die in the cold and do not return spontaneously when the temperature rises. They have to recolonize from surviving pockets, spread through root networks that no longer exist, rebuild trophic layers from the ground up. It is slow, it is passive, it cannot be hurried, unless someone hurries it. I pulled up the close-range orbital scans my shuttle had taken on approach, and felt something go cold and quiet in my chest. The valley I was observing was not an anomaly. It was one of thousands. Across the northern continent alone, I could identify over 600 similar settlements, irrigated agriculture, rebuilt infrastructure, functioning communities. The southern continents showed fewer, but they were there. Clusters of heat signatures and patterns consistent with organized habitation, not the random scatter of survivors huddling in ruins. I ran a rough population estimate based on settlement density and average observed community size. Between 40 and 60 million human beings were alive on Sol 3. My report had predicted 0. I should have called it in immediately. Protocol for a verification discrepancy of this magnitude is unambiguous. Transmit findings to the Bureau. Request a full survey team. Maintain concealment. Do not interact. The species status would be reclassified, the extinction report voided, and a new trajectory assessment initiated. I did not call it in. I told myself it was because I needed more data. A responsible analyst does not report a 400-point discrepancy without understanding its cause. I needed to determine how they had survived, what mechanisms they had employed, and whether their current population was stable or in delayed decline. A species can appear to have survived an extinction event, while actually being in terminal demographic collapse. The numbers look alive, but the age distribution, the genetic diversity, the reproductive rate, all point toward a slower, quieter ending. I needed to know if these humans were actually living or simply dying more slowly than I had predicted. That is what I told myself. The truth is simpler and worse. I did not call it in because if I called it in, the Bureau would ask how they survived. And if we determined how they survived, the answer might invalidate more than Report 389. It might invalidate the methodology. And if the methodology was wrong for Sol 3, it might be wrong for others. And some of those others were not yet past their predicted windows. I stayed. I watched. I moved my shuttle to a concealed position in the hills above the valley, and I began what I told myself was a rigorous field study, and what I now recognize was the longest and most consequential act of cowardice in my career. On the third day, they found me. I was not as concealed as I believed. My shuttle's optical camouflage was designed for orbital distance observation and atmospheric survey, not for hiding from a ground-level search party that knew its own terrain. I had underestimated them in the most basic possible way. I had assumed they were not looking up. They were always looking up. The woman who found me was perhaps 40 years old, though aging was difficult to assess. The humans I observed all appeared weathered beyond their years, their skin marked by exposure, their hands thickened with labor. She came alone, walking up the hillside in the early morning carrying a ceramic jug and 2 cups, as though she were meeting a neighbor for a conversation she had been expecting. She stopped 10 meters from my shuttle, set the jug on a flat stone, and said in heavily accented but structurally perfect Concord standard, "We've known you were here since you landed. If you're going to watch us, you should at least come have tea." I did not move. "My name is Isiajay," she said. "I'm the head woman of Millbrook. That's the settlement in the valley. You've been counting us for 3 days, so you probably already know we have 411 people. 412. As of last night, Tomoko's baby came early." She paused. "It's a girl." I opened the shuttle door, not because I had decided anything, but because the way she said "it's a girl," with a brightness that cut through the morning air like something sharp and warm, made it impossible to sit in the dark pretending I was not there. She was smaller than I expected. Humans are a compact species relative to most Concord members, but the files always emphasized their density, their musculature, their death world-adapted bone structure. Standing in front of me, Essie Ajay did not look like a death world predator. She looked like a tired woman with calloused hands and steady eyes who had brought tea to an alien sitting on her hill. "You're from the Concord," she said. It was not a question. "I am a senior extinction analyst with the Bureau of Species Trajectory." She nodded slowly as though the sentence confirmed something she had already known but wished she hadn't. "Extinction analyst, so you're here to check that we're dead." "I am here to conduct a post-extinction verification survey." "And?" The question sat between us like a stone. "And you are not extinct," I said. Sciaj poured tea into both cups. She handed one to me. The cup was warm in my hands. Crude ceramic, thick-walled, glazed in an uneven blue-green that caught the morning light. "No," she said. "We're not." She walked me through the settlement that afternoon. I told myself I was gathering data. I was not gathering data. I was being shown something, and I was too disoriented to understand what it was or why she was showing it to me. Millbrook was 11 years old. It had been founded 8 months after the impact by a group of survivors from 3 separate bunker sites who had emerged into the ash winter and walked on foot through temperatures that would have killed most conquered species in hours for 11 days until they found this valley. The valley had a microclimate advantage. The surrounding hills blocked the worst of the ash-laden winds, and a geothermal spring near the river's source kept the ground temperature above freezing even at the impact winter's nadir. They had started with 47 people, 12 of whom were children. "The first year was the worst," Essie said, walking me past a building she identified as the school. Through the windows I could see children sitting on benches, listening to a man drawing diagrams on a salvaged whiteboard. "We lost 9 people that first winter. Cold, mostly. 2 to injuries we couldn't treat. We didn't have a doctor. We had a veterinarian and a paramedic, and a woman who'd been halfway through nursing school when the sky fell. They kept the rest of us alive with veterinary antibiotics and a surgical textbook someone had packed instead of extra food." Instead of food. She said she figured someone else would bring food, but no one would think to bring the book. Acey glanced at me. She was right. I made a note. It was not a useful note. I was writing things down because writing things down is what I do when I don't know what to do. She showed me the granary. It was partially underground, built into the hillside with thick stone walls and a ventilation system I recognized as remarkably sophisticated. A passive airflow design that regulated temperature and humidity without mechanical assistance. The grain stores were substantial, more than substantial. There was enough food in that granary to feed the settlement for 2 years. "You store a 2-year surplus," I said. 3-year, once the new silos are finished. That is unusual for a community of this size. Essie stopped walking. She looked at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize. Not hostile, not warm, but layered. Like she was deciding how much truth the conversation could hold. "Analyst Vishari," she said. "Something hit our planet 11 years ago. Something big enough to block out the sun for 2 years and kill 7 billion people. We don't know what it was. We don't know where it came from. We don't know if it was natural or if someone sent it." She held my gaze. "We store a 3-year surplus because we are never going to be hungry again, not because we think we won't be, because we refuse to be." I did not write that down. I should have. It was the most important data point I had collected in 31 years, and I let it pass because I was not yet ready to understand what it meant. She introduced me to people. Not as a visiting dignitary, not as an alien observer. She introduced me by my professional title, and every person I met processed the words extinction analyst with the same expression. A brief stillness, a flicker behind the eyes that was not surprise, and then a nod that seemed to say yes, of course. That would be why they came. They were not shocked that the galaxy had a department for tracking their death. They had, apparently, already worked it out. A man named Kaito Oshiro ran the settlement's soil recovery program. He was the one I needed to talk to because the soil was the part I could not explain. He was slight, soft-spoken, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and he spoke about mycorrhizal inoculation networks with the intensity of someone describing a lover. "The trick was the fungi," he said, crouching in a field and lifting a clump of earth for me to examine. I could see the white threads of mycelium lacing through the dark soil like a vascular system. The impact killed the surface biome, but the deep fungal networks, some of them survived. Meters down in the root zones of old-growth forests that burned. We found viable spore caches in the ash layers and cultured them. Took us 2 years to get a stable inoculation culture. Another year to figure out the deployment. You can't just scatter spores. You need to build the bacterial pre-layer first, give them something to colonize. He talked for 40 minutes. I recorded all of it. The methodology was, I lack a professional term that is not also an admission of my own failure. It was creative in a way my models had not accounted for. My extinction projections assumed that soil recovery was a passive process because it had always been a passive process in every case I had studied. Humans had made it active. They had treated the dead Earth not as a terminal condition but as an engineering problem, and they had solved it with veterinary antibiotics, salvaged laboratory equipment, and a woman named Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who had been a soil microbiologist at a university that no longer existed, and who had spent the first year of the impact winter writing a recovery protocol by candlelight in a bunker. She was dead now, pneumonia year 3, but her protocol was alive in every field I could see. "How did you know to do this?" I asked Kaito. "The soil recovery methodology, it's not in any of your published agricultural literature. I reviewed your species' scientific database as part of the trajectory assessment." He looked at me oddly. "We didn't know. We figured it out." "In 2 years?" "We had to. The alternative was starving." I stared at the soil in his hands and felt the first structural crack in something I had believed for 31 years. My models predicted species behavior based on observed capability, what humans could do based on what they had done. But humans apparently did not operate within the boundary of what they had done. They operated within the boundary of what they needed to do, and they expanded that boundary by refusing to accept the alternative. My models had no variable for that. There is no coefficient for refusal. On the 4th day, I accessed the full Bureau database from my shuttle and ran a query I had never run before. I searched for all species on the current trajectory list whose extinction projections relied on the assumption that soil recovery, atmospheric remediation, or biome reconstruction were passive processes. There were 37 species across 37 worlds currently classified as terminal trajectory, meaning they were subject to triage deprioritization, meaning resources that might sustain them were being redirected to species the Bureau had determined were viable based on the same assumption that humans had just proven wrong. I sat with that number for a long time. 37 species that might not be dying. 37 worlds where people might be figuring it out, the way Kaito Oshiro had figured it out, the way Dr. Yuki Tanaka had figured it out by candlelight in a bunker while the sky burned. 37 populations that might be looking up at a dark sky and inventing solutions my models said were impossible, and who would never receive help because my reports said they were already dead. And under that number, a worse one. Of those 37, 9 had been subject to natural event corrections, asteroid redirects like Sol 3, atmospheric destabilization events, orbital perturbations that shifted climate zones beyond survivable parameters. 9 species that the Concord had killed. Not all of them had been my assessments. I had signed 4 reports that said this species will not survive the corrective event, and on the basis of those reports, the Boundary Enforcement Division had acted and the species had presumably died. Presumably, because I had not yet conducted the verification surveys. I closed the database. I opened it again. I closed it. I thought about Esi Adje saying we store a 3-year surplus because we refuse to be hungry again. I thought about a woman packing a surgical textbook instead of food. I thought about Kaito's missing fingers and the white threads of mycelium lacing through soil that should have been sterile. Then I opened a different file, not the current trajectory list, the archived one. The historical record of every species the Bureau had classified as terminal trajectory in the last 300 years. The full 3 centuries of the Bureau's operational existence. 412 extinction reports. My 412. Plus my predecessor's work, the total archive contained over 2,000. I ran the query again, broader this time. Of all species ever classified as terminal trajectory, how many had been subject to verification surveys? The answer was all of them. How many verification surveys had found discrepancies? I expected 0. Or perhaps 1 or 2 marginal cases, statistical noise. The answer was 144. I stared at the number. 144 verification surveys had returned findings inconsistent with the extinction report. Surviving populations where none should exist. Infrastructure where ruins were predicted. Agricultural activity on worlds classified as biologically inert. 144. I searched for the follow-up reports. the reclassification requests, the revised trajectory assessments, the acknowledgement that the original reports had been wrong and the surviving populations required updated status. There were none. 144 discrepancies over 3 centuries, and not a single reclassification. Every one of those findings had been filed, noted, and archived without action. The species remained classified as extinct. The surviving populations remained invisible. The resources continued to flow away from them and toward the species the Bureau had determined were worth saving. I went deeper. I pulled the individual discrepancy reports. Most were brief, a few paragraphs noting unexpected findings, a recommendation for further study, a standard closing. But some were longer, detailed, urgent. One from an analyst named Torek Vashen, who had surveyed a world called Irida 4 80 years ago, ran to 40 pages. He had found 2 million survivors of a species the Bureau had declared extinct after a climate destabilization event. 2 million people, rebuilding, adapting, developing new agricultural techniques suited to their altered atmosphere. His report was meticulous, passionate, and unambiguous. The species was viable, the extinction classification was wrong, and the triage deprioritization should be immediately reversed. His report had been received, stamped, and filed. No action taken, no reclassification. Torek Vashen had submitted 7 follow-up requests over the next 2 years. Each was acknowledged and archived. After the 7th, his employment record showed a transfer to the Bureau's cartographic division, where he spent the remaining 19 years of his career mapping gas giant atmospheric bands. Irida 4's species designation still read, extinct. I searched for current data on Irida 4. The last orbital survey, conducted 40 years after Torek Vashen's visit, showed no sapient life signatures. 2 million people, and 40 years later, nothing. Not because they couldn't survive, they had been surviving, but without conquered resources, without medical supplies, without atmospheric stabilizers, without the genetic diversity support that triage prioritized species received as a matter of course. The recovery that Torek Vashen had documented was not enough. The delayed decline that my own models would have predicted, the slow, quiet ending that looks like living but is actually dying, had taken them after all. They had survived the killing blow. They had not survived being ignored. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my shuttle in the dark above Millbrook, and I thought about what I was. I was not a murderer. I had not redirected any asteroids. I had not destabilized any atmospheres. I had signed reports. I had verified trajectories. I had applied a methodology that I believed was rigorous and evidence-based, and I had drawn conclusions that I believed were accurate. But my methodology did not account for refusal, and my conclusions had been used to justify killing. And when the conclusions were wrong, when the verification surveys came back showing living people where the reports said there should be corpses, the system I served did not correct itself. It filed the discrepancy and moved on. Because the purpose of the system was not accuracy, the purpose was triage, and triage only works if the line you draw is final. If species can come back, if the dead can refuse to stay dead, then the line means nothing. And if the line means nothing, then every resource allocation decision the Bureau has ever made is open to challenge. Every world written off, every population deprioritized. Every species allowed to quietly expire because the numbers said they were already gone. 300 years of extinction reports, 2,000 species, 144 known discrepancies suppressed. How many of those 144 had eventually died? How many had died because they were classified as already dead, because the help that might have sustained them was directed elsewhere on the basis of reports like mine? And how many were still alive right now, on worlds the Bureau had written off, refusing to die in the dark while the galaxy spent its resources on species that the numbers said deserved to live? I did not know. I did not know. And the not knowing was not ignorance. It was the shape of everything I had failed to ask in 31 years of being very, very good at my job. On the 5th day, Essie took me to the school. I had seen it from outside. Through the windows, children on benches, diagrams on salvaged whiteboards. It had looked organized, functional, unremarkable. Inside, it was something else. The school occupied what had once been a ground-floor commercial space, a shop or office of some kind, its original purpose obscured by 11 years of conversion. The walls had been replastered and painted white. and every centimeter of white space was covered. Not with educational materials, not with charts or schedules or administrative notices, with drawings, paintings, handwritten texts in languages I could not read. Photographs, physical photographs, printed on paper, water-damaged and carefully restored, mounted behind salvaged glass. Maps drawn by hand in colored ink showing the settlement, the valley, the river, the surrounding hills with landmarks labeled in a child's handwriting. Tomoko's Rock, the place where the deer came back. Old Bridge, New Bridge, the hill where the alien is sitting. That last one was labeled with an arrow pointing upward and a small figure with too many limbs sitting next to a rectangle that was clearly my shuttle. I stopped in front of it. Marisol drew that, Essie said. She was standing behind me, watching me look at the wall. She's 9. She's been watching us since you arrived. She thinks you have beautiful hands. I have 4 hands. Humans have 2. I looked at the drawing, and the small figure's 4 hands were rendered with enormous care, each finger distinct, each joint articulated. The figure was sitting very still, and around it, in the colored pencil sky, Marisol had drawn stars. "This is your school," I said. "This is our memory," Essie said. "The school is what happens here. The walls are why." She walked me along them. The oldest drawings near the back were crude stick figures, smudged charcoal on bare concrete. They showed fire, darkness, figures huddled together in spaces that looked like bunkers. A recurring image, a circle with lines radiating from it that I recognized after a moment as the sun. Drawn by children who had not seen it in 2 years. The drawings got more sophisticated as they moved forward in time. Colored pencils appeared. Paint. The subject shifted, the bunker scenes gave way to landscapes, to buildings, to people working in fields. Animals appeared. First in memory. I could tell because the proportions were wrong, idealized, drawn from stories rather than observation. And then from life. The proportions corrected, the details sharper, because the animals had come back and the children could see them. And throughout, woven between the images like a thread through fabric, the handwritten texts, poems, letters, stories, names everywhere. "After the impact," Essie said quietly, "we lost most of our digital records. The EMP took the servers, the cloud networks, everything stored electronically. We had some physical books, some paper documents, but most of what we knew about who we had been was gone. So we started writing it down again. Everyone in the settlement, their names, where they came from, who they had lost, what they remembered." She touched the wall, her fingertips resting on a passage written in small, precise handwriting. "This is Grandmother Oyelaran's entry. She was 81 when she got here. She had been a professor of literature at the University of Ibadan. She couldn't carry books through the ash, so she carried them in her head. She spent the last 4 years of her life dictating everything she could remember: poems, novels, histories, children's stories. The older children wrote them down. When she died, we put her entry on the wall and kept writing. I read Grandmother Oyelaran's entry. It was in a language I did not speak, but my translation system rendered it in real time. My name is Chidinma Oyelaran. I was born in Abeokuta. I remember the smell of rain on red earth. I remember my mother's hands shaping dough. I remember the sound of my daughter's voice calling me from the next room, and I will carry that sound past every fire and through every dark until I set it down in a place where someone will hear it again." Under her entry, in a child's handwriting, someone had added, "Grandmother Oyelaran died on March 3rd, year 4. She was not afraid. She said the story was long enough." I stood in front of that wall for a long time. Essie waited. "Analyst Vashari," she said eventually, "why are you really here?" I could have maintained the cover. Post-extinction verification survey, routine procedure, bureaucratic follow-up. But I was standing in front of Grandmother Oyelaran's last words, written by a child who had listened, and I found that I could not add another fiction to a career that was already built on them. 11 years ago, I said, I signed a report that classified your species as terminal trajectory. Based on that report, the Concord authorized a corrective action. The asteroid that struck your world was not a natural event. It was redirected, deliberately. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was not a gasp, not a shocked stillness. It was the silence of confirmation. The silence of someone hearing out loud what they have already suspected in the dark. "We know. Essie said. I turned to look at her. We've known for 7 years, she said. Her voice was steady, controlled. Not calm-controlled, which is different. Calm is the absence of turmoil. Control is turmoil managed. 3 years after the impact, a woman named Dr. Anya Petrov, an astrophysicist, she was in one of the Ural mountain bunker complexes, reconstructed the asteroid's trajectory from observational data that had been stored on a hardened military server. The approach vector was wrong. Not just unusual, physically impossible for a natural body in that orbital family. Someone changed its course. You've known for 7 years. Yes. And you did not. I stopped because I did not know how to finish the sentence. Did not what? Did not despair? Did not collapse? Did not turn inward and tear themselves apart with the knowledge that their apocalypse was authored? Did not what? Essie asked, as though she had heard the question I couldn't form. Stop planting? Stop building? Stop having children? She looked at the wall, at Grandmother Oyeleran's entry, at Marisol's drawing of me on the hill with my 4 beautiful hands. We considered it, she said. There were 6 months where knowing nearly destroyed us. People wanted to find the ones who did it. People wanted to scream at the sky. People wanted to stop. What changed? Tomoko's daughter was born, the first baby born after we found out. Tomoko named her Astra because she said the stars owed her a child and she was collecting. Essie's voice thinned but did not break. You can't hold a newborn baby and choose to die, Analyst Vashari. You can't look at something that small and that new and decide the universe's opinion of your species matters more than the next feeding. So we planted, we built, we kept going, not because we forgave what was done, because the baby needed to eat and the grain needed water and the wall needed another name. She looked at me. Why are you telling me this? About the asteroid, about your report. And there it was. The question I had been circling for 5 days, the one I had buried under professional protocol and data collection, and the comfortable fiction that I was here to observe. Because I found something in the Bureau's records, I said. Your world is not the only one. There are others. Other species classified as extinct that may still be alive. Others that were killed by corrective actions based on reports like mine. And I believe the Bureau has known about the discrepancies for centuries and suppressed them. How many? I don't know yet. At least 144 confirmed cases of surviving populations on worlds classified as sterile, possibly more. AC was quiet for a long time. The sounds of the settlement came through the open windows, the creak of the grain separator, a child's voice, the distant ring of a hammer on metal. What are you going to do? She asked. I don't know. That's not good enough. I know. She looked at the wall again, at the names, at the drawings, at the handprints. I had not noticed the handprints, small ones in colored paint, pressed onto the plaster between the written entries like signatures made by people who could not yet write. On that wall, Essie said, there are the names of every person who died in this settlement, 103 in 11 years. Next to each name is the cause of death: cold, infection, injury, childbirth, old age. Do you know what is not written next to any of them? I waited, gave up. Not once, not one of them. Every person on that wall died in the middle of something: carrying water, or teaching a child, or repairing a roof, or planting a seed they would never see grow. They died with their hands full. She turned to face me fully. You wrote a report that said we would lie down and die. You were wrong. Now you found a filing cabinet full of other species you were wrong about too, and some of them are still out there, being wrong about right now, while you stand in my school trying to decide what you are. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. So I will tell you what you are, Analyst Vashari. You are a person with a shuttle and a Concord security clearance and access to a database that contains the locations of every world your Bureau has written off. That is what you are. The question is what you do with it. I spent the 6th day in my shuttle with the Bureau database open and a growing document on my secondary display that I did not yet have a name for. I began with the 144 known discrepancies. Each was a verification survey that had returned findings inconsistent with the extinction report: surviving populations, rebuilt infrastructure, agricultural activity. I had found these on my fourth night. Now I went deeper. I cross-referenced each discrepancy with the species' original trajectory classification. Had the extinction been predicted as natural, or had it been the result of a corrective action? Of the 144, 81 had been natural trajectory species worlds where environmental collapse, resource depletion, or demographic decline had been predicted to complete the extinction without intervention. 63 had been corrective action species worlds where the conquered had intervened to accelerate an extinction that was predicted but not yet certain. I focused on the 63. The corrective actions varied. Asteroid redirects like Sol 3, atmospheric seeding introducing compounds that accelerated ozone depletion or triggered runaway greenhouse effects, pathogen release, targeted biological agents designed to push a population below replacement threshold, orbital mechanics adjustments, subtle gravitational perturbations that shifted a world's axial tilt or orbital eccentricity enough to destabilize climate zones over a period of decades. Each one had been authorized on the basis of a trajectory report that classified the species as terminal. Each report concluded that the species would not survive the corrective event, and in 63 cases the verification survey found that they had. 63 species that had survived being murdered. I looked for the current status of each. 22 had been verified as extinct on subsequent surveys. They had survived the initial event but died later, like Irida 4. The suppressed discrepancy reports had ensured they received no assistance during their recovery window, and the recovery had failed. 14 had no subsequent survey data at all. The Bureau had simply never gone back. 27 were listed as verified extinct, but the verification dates were irregular, some decades after the discrepancy report, some within years. I could not determine from the records alone whether these verifications were genuine or whether they had been conducted with the discrepancy already known and the conclusion predetermined. And then there were the trajectory models themselves. I am an extinction analyst. I know how these models work because I built many of them. The core methodology is sound population dynamics, resource curves, environmental carrying capacity. These are real variables with real predictive power, but the methodology has a hidden architecture that I had never examined because I had never needed to. The models classify species behavior as either adaptive passive or adaptive reactive. Passive adaptation means the species responds to environmental change through existing behavioral repertoires, migration, diet shifts, resource rationing. Reactive adaptation means the species develops new responses to novel threats, invents technology, reorganizes social structures, creates solutions that did not previously exist. Every species in the Bureau's 300-year history had been classified as adaptive passive. Every single one. The model contained a reactive adaptation module, but it had a flag, a small notation in the codebase that I had to dig through 3 layers of administrative access to find. The flag read, Reactive Adaptation Coefficient, locked at 0. Override requires director-level authorization. Last modified, Year 1, Cycle 1. The very first day the Bureau had been operational, someone had set the reactive adaptation variable to 0 and locked it. The models could not account for species that invented their way out of extinction because the models had been designed, from their inception, to assume that no species ever would. I thought about Kaito Oshiro crouching in a field, holding soil that should not exist. I thought about Dr. Yuki Tanaka writing a recovery protocol by candlelight. I thought about a woman packing a surgical textbook instead of food. I thought about Torek Vashin's 40-page report, stamped and filed and buried while 2 million people on Irida 4 waited for help that would never come. And I thought about the 14 species with no subsequent survey data, the ones the Bureau had never gone back to check on. 14 worlds scattered across the Concord's administrative envelope, where living people might exist right now, might be harvesting grain, or teaching children, or writing names on walls, and no one in the galaxy knew, because the report said they were dead, and the report was the only thing anyone looked at. I made a decision. It was not a brave decision. A brave decision would have been to transmit my findings to the Bureau and demand an investigation, to stand on the record and challenge 3 centuries of institutional fraud from within. That is what a person with integrity would do. But I had spent 31 years inside the institution, and I knew what would happen to a report that challenged the Bureau's foundational methodology. It would be received, stamped, and filed, like Torek Vashin's, like all 144 before it. And then I would be transferred to the cartographic division and my findings would join the archive of things the Conquered chose not to know. So instead, I stole everything. I copied the full discrepancy archive, all 144 reports, all 63 corrective action files, the locked model parameters, the suppressed verification data. I copied Torek Vashin's 40 pages. I copied the 14 unverified worlds. I compressed it into a file small enough to transmit on a civilian channel, and I encrypted it with a key I gave to Sci-Fi. I don't know what to do with this, I told her, standing in the settlement's small communications building, a repurposed shipping container with a salvaged antenna array on the roof. I know what I should do, but I am not the right person. I am the person who signed the reports. I am the one who drew the line. Anything I say will be dismissed as a disgruntled analyst with a methodology dispute. Then don't say it, Essie said. Give it to someone who will. Who? She looked at me with that expression again. The layered one, the one that was deciding how much the moment could hold. You said 14 worlds might still have people alive. People the Conquered thinks are dead. Yes. Then it doesn't matter who says it. It matters who goes. I want to be precise about what happened next, because the precision is the point. I am an analyst. The only thing I have ever been able to offer the universe is accuracy. If I cannot offer it now, when accuracy is finally a matter of life rather than death, then I was never what I claimed to be. On the morning of my 7th day on Sol 3, Sci-Fi walked me to the settlement's communications array and introduced me to a man I had not previously met. His name was Dio Okonkwo. He was 28 years old. He had been 12 when the asteroid hit. He had walked through the ash with his father for 9 days before they found Millbrook. His father died on the 10th day of hypothermia, 1 day after arriving. Dio had been a child sitting next to a body in the cold, and now he was the settlement's communications officer, which meant he was the person who maintained the antenna array and monitored the frequencies. All of the frequencies. We've been listening since year 2, Dio said. He was tall and thin with precise hands and a voice that carried a slight vibration, as though the act of speaking required calibration. First just local, trying to find other survivors, coordinating between settlements. But the antenna we built could do more than local. Once we got the range up, we started picking up Concord traffic. You've been listening to Concord Communications? We can't decrypt the encrypted channels, but the Concord uses a lot of open broadcast navigational beacons, trade postings, diplomatic announcements, news feeds. We've been listening to the galaxy talk for 9 years. I processed this. We know the names of every conquered species, Dio said. We know the major trade routes, the political alliances, the disputed territories. We know about the Bureau, Analyst Vishari. We've known about the Bureau for 6 years. We've heard your kind talk about species trajectory classification on open academic channels. We know what you do. You know what the Bureau does, and you did not attempt to make contact? Dio and AC exchanged a glance. It lasted less than a second, but it contained a conversation I was not part of. We contacted the Conquered once, Essie said, 3 years ago. An open channel broadcast identifying ourselves as survivors of Sol 3, requesting humanitarian assistance and diplomatic contact. I saw no record of this in the Bureau's database. No, you wouldn't have, because the response we received was not from the Bureau, it was from Boundary Enforcement. She let the name sit. They told us on an encrypted channel we could only partially decode that our survival was noted and that our status was under review. They advised us to limit electromagnetic emissions to minimize observational profile, and then they sent a suppression drone. A suppression drone. An automated signal jammer, parked in high orbit. It sat there for 8 months, blanking every transmission we sent above a certain power threshold. We couldn't talk to the other settlements. We couldn't coordinate. 2 communities nearly starved because they couldn't reach us for seed exchange during planting season. We took it down, Dio said quietly. I looked at him. It was broadcasting on a predictable frequency rotation. We mapped the pattern, built a directional emitter from salvaged parts, and overloaded its receiver array. Took us 4 months. The thing fell into the atmosphere and burned up. You destroyed a Concord autonomous enforcement drone with salvaged equipment. It was trying to kill us with silence, Dio said. We've had enough silence. He showed me the communications logs. 9 years of intercepted Concord broadcasts, cataloged and cross-referenced with a rigor that would have impressed any analyst at the Bureau. Trade data, fleet movements, political speeches, scientific publications. They had built a picture of the galaxy from the outside, from the dark, from the position of a species that had been declared dead and was listening to the living talk about them in the past tense. And they had done something else. We found the others, Dio said. He pulled up a display hand-built, cobbled from salvaged screens and circuitry but functional. On it was a star map. Not a Concord star map. A human one assembled from intercepted navigational data and painstakingly verified against optical observations from ground-based telescopes they had built themselves. On the map, 14 points were marked in red. These are the 14 worlds you found in the Bureau's records, Dio said. The ones with no subsequent verification. We've been scanning for them. Not with anything powerful enough to confirm life signs at interstellar distances, we don't have that capability. But 3 of them are close enough that we've been able to detect anomalous electromagnetic emissions. Anomalous how? Structured, repeating. Not natural. I stared at the map. 3 of the 14 worlds you found have something alive on them that is producing organized electromagnetic signals. We can't decode them. We can't confirm sapient origin, but the pattern is there. How long have you known this? 2 years. And you haven't what? Sent a ship. We don't have ships, Analyst Vashari. We have 112 settlements scattered across a planet that was nearly killed, and we have a communications array built from scrap. And we have signals from 3 worlds that might have people on them who think they are alone in the universe, because your Bureau told the galaxy they were dead. He was not angry. He was precise. The precision was worse than anger would have been. We can't reach them, Essie said. We don't have the technology. We don't have the resources, but you do. I need to describe what I did next as what it was, not what I wish it had been. What I wish it had been, a moment of moral clarity, a decision made cleanly, from conviction, by a person who understood the stakes and accepted the cost. What it was, a calculation. I am an analyst. Calculations are what I do. And the calculation I performed on the morning of my 8th day on Sol 3 was this. If I returned to the Bureau and filed my findings through official channels, the findings would be suppressed. I would be reassigned. The 14 unverified worlds would remain unverified. The 37 currently classified terminal trajectory species would continue to be deprioritized. The locked variable would remain locked. Nothing would change. If I transmitted the stolen data to the Concord's general public through open channels, the Bureau would immediately classify it as a security breach, discredit the data as compromised, and issue a warrant for my arrest. The information would be available but contested, drowning in institutional counter-narrative before anyone could act on it. If I transmitted the data to a single trusted recipient, a journalist, a Concord legislator, an allied academic, the Bureau's response would be slower, but the outcome would be the same. One voice against 3 centuries of institutional consensus is a whisper in a wind tunnel. But if the data went to someone the Bureau could not discredit, could not suppress, could not quietly archive, someone whose very existence was already a refutation of the Bureau's foundational premise. I need you to send this, I told Essie. Not me, you. She was sitting at the communications console in the repurposed shipping container, the morning light coming through the small window and falling across the displays where Dio's star map still glowed with its 14 red points. Send it where? Everywhere. Every open Concord channel, every navigational beacon, every trade frequency, every diplomatic broadcast band. The full discrepancy archive, the locked model parameters, the corrective action files, all of it. But send it from here. From Sol 3. From a human transmitter with a human identification header. From a species the Bureau certified as extinct 11 years ago. Why does it matter that it comes from us? Because the Bureau can dismiss me. They cannot dismiss you. You are the evidence. Your existence, your settlements, your fields, your school, your children. You are a 400-person proof that the Bureau's methodology is wrong. If the data comes from you, from a world that was supposed to be dead, the Bureau cannot call it a methodology dispute. They have to explain why you are alive. Essie looked at me for a long time. You're asking us to announce ourselves to the galaxy, the same galaxy that dropped an asteroid on us. Yes. You're asking us to trust the species that tried to kill us. I am asking you to trust that the species that tried to kill you are not the only ones listening. She looked at the star map, at the 3 red points that were producing structured electromagnetic emissions, at the 11 others that were dark. Dio, she said, how long to format the file for broadband transmission? 4 hours if I compress the data and strip the Bureau encryption headers. Do it, she turned back to me. Not because I trust the Concord, I don't, but there might be people on those 14 worlds who have been listening to silence for longer than we have. And if there's a chance that one of them is sitting next to a radio right now, waiting for someone to tell them they're not alone. She stopped, started again. My daughter was born in a bunker. The first sound she heard was her mother crying from relief. The second sound was nothing. Radio silence. 11 days of radio silence before we found another living voice. I will not let someone else's child sit in that silence one day longer than I can help. The transmission went out at 1400 local time on my 8th day on Sol 3, which was the 9th day of what the Millbrook settlement calendar designated as Year 11, Month 7. It was not elegant. The equipment was salvaged, the antenna array was improvised, and the signal had to be boosted through a relay network of 7 smaller settlements' transmitters to achieve sufficient power for interstellar range. The data file was large, nearly 4 terabytes of Bureau records, compressed and encrypted with a key that Essie included in the transmission header, along with a decryption algorithm written in Concord standard mathematical notation. The header itself was simple. Dio had drafted it, Essie had edited it. I had verified the Concord standard translation. It read, "This is the human settlement of Millbrook, Sol 3, Orion Spur. We were classified as extinct 11 years ago under Bureau of Species Trajectory, Report 389. We are not extinct. We are 57 million people on a planet that was targeted for destruction by the Concord Boundary Enforcement Division. We survived. Attached is evidence that we are not the only ones. 144 species classified as extinct showed surviving populations on verification surveys. 63 of those species were killed by deliberate Concord action. 14 have never been resurveyed. 3 are currently producing electromagnetic signals consistent with sapient life. We are broadcasting this data because we cannot reach them and you can. If there is anyone in this galaxy who believes that being alive is reason enough to be helped, then help them. We are proof that your models are wrong. We are proof that the dead do not always stay dead. And we are not asking for your permission to exist. We are informing you that we do. The transmission repeated on a 12-minute cycle, continuously, across every frequency Dio's equipment could reach. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Then the responses started coming. The first response was from a Concord trade vessel, a Velhari merchant hauler, transiting the outer Orion Spur on a standard cargo run. The captain, a Velhari named Sareth, had picked up the transmission on their general-purpose receiver and initially flagged it as signal noise. When the data file decrypted and the Bureau records displayed on her console, she broke transit protocol and forwarded the entire package to her company's home office, which forwarded it to the Velhari Diplomatic Service, which forwarded it to the Concord Assembly's Communications Directorate. By the time the Concord Assembly received the file, it had already been independently captured and decrypted by 43 separate receivers across 11 species territories. Dio's broadband approach, blasting the transmission across every available frequency, had ensured that suppression was geometrically impossible. The data was not in one place. It was everywhere. The Bureau's response was fast. Within 6 hours of the initial transmission, the Director of Species Trajectory issued a public statement characterizing the broadcast as a sophisticated signal fabrication originating from an unverified source, likely an adversarial intelligence operation designed to undermine confidence in Concord resource allocation protocols. The statement noted that Sol 3 had been confirmed extinct under Report 389 and that any claims of surviving human populations were inconsistent with verified data. This might have worked if the Bureau had not, at the same time, dispatched a Boundary Enforcement Rapid Response Unit to Sol 3, with orders to locate and neutralize the transmission source. The dispatch order was sent on an encrypted channel, but the encryption protocol had been updated 3 years ago, and the update had been distributed through the same navigational beacon network that Dio had been monitoring for 9 years. He had the new keys. He decrypted the dispatch order in real time and rebroadcast it on the same open channels he had used for the original transmission. The galaxy watched the Bureau publicly deny that humans existed while simultaneously sending a military unit to silence them. I have to talk about the 3 signals now. While the Bureau was managing its collapsing narrative and the Concord Assembly was convening emergency sessions, something else was happening on a frequency that almost no one was monitoring. Dio caught it first. He was at the communications console, tracking the spread of their transmission through the Concord network, when his equipment flagged an incoming signal on a narrow band that was not part of the standard Concord spectrum. It was faint, it was structured, and it was originating from one of the 14 red points on his star map. Not one of the 3 that had previously shown electromagnetic activity. A 4th. "They heard us," he said. His voice was doing that vibration thing again, the calibration tremor, and his hands were shaking. "They heard us, and they're answering." Over the next 48 hours, 12 more signals appeared. 12. Not from the 3 previously active worlds, from 12 of the 11 remaining silent ones. Worlds that had shown no electromagnetic emissions during 9 years of human monitoring. Worlds where, as far as Dio's equipment could determine, nothing sapient had been broadcasting. They had been listening. All of them. Listening in the dark, with receivers they had built from whatever they had, monitoring frequencies they had no reason to monitor, except the hope that someday someone would speak. And when the Millbrook transmission went out, when a species that had been declared dead told the galaxy it was alive, and there might be others, 12 species that had been sitting in silence for decades answered at once. I cannot describe the sound. I am an analyst, not a poet. But I will try. Each signal was different. Different frequency, different modulation, different encoding. They had no shared language, no common protocol. One was a simple repeating pulse on, off, the most basic possible confirmation of sapient presence. Another was a complex mathematical sequence that took Dio 6 hours to partially decode, and appeared to be a compressed agricultural data set. A third was music. Just music. A melody played on an instrument I could not identify, transmitted into the void by someone who had heard a voice and responded with the only thing they had. I sat in the communications container and listened to 12 dead species singing, and I understood, for the first time in my 31-year career, what I had actually been doing. I had not been cataloging extinctions, I had been enforcing them. Every report I signed, every trajectory I verified, every line I drew between viable and terminal, I had been building the walls of a silence that kept these people invisible. Not because they were dead, because I said they were, and the galaxy believed me, and no one looked. Essie found me sitting on the floor of the container at some point during the night. I don't know what time it was. The signals were still playing through the speakers. Dio had rigged a rotation, cycling through the 12 incoming transmissions, so each one had its moment in the air. The music was playing when she came in. The alien instrument, the melody, the voice of someone on a world I had probably signed the death certificate for. "How many?" she asked. 12 new respondents, plus the 3 previously active. 15 of the 14 are alive. You said 14. One of them is responding from coordinates that don't match any of the 14 on the Bureau's list. It's a 15th, a world we didn't even know about. Essie sat down next to me. The music played. "Analyst Vashari," she said. "How many species has the Bureau classified as extinct in total?" "Over 2,000. How many had verification surveys conducted?" "All of them." "How many surveys found discrepancies?" 144 that I found in the accessible records. But the accessible records only go back 300 years, and the filing system is there are layers I couldn't reach, archive partitions that require clearances above mine. So the real number could be higher. The real number could be much higher. She was quiet for a while. The music shifted. The rotation had moved to the next signal, the mathematical sequence. A pattern of tones that rose and fell in intervals Dio had said corresponded to soil composition data. "They're telling us what they've been doing," AC said. "The agricultural data, the music. They're not just saying, 'We're here.' They're saying, 'Look what we built.'" Yes, that was exactly what they were saying. And I had been trained, for 31 years, to look at what species built and calculate how long it would last before it collapsed. I had been the galaxy's instrument for measuring the distance between a civilization and its grave. I did not know how to be anything else. But the music was playing and the soil data was scrolling across the screen, and somewhere on a world I could not name, someone was broadcasting the sound of what they had made, and the only response I was qualified to give was a number that predicted when they would stop. "I need to go to those worlds," I said. Essie looked at me. "Not as a bureau analyst, not to assess their trajectory. I need to go and count the living. I need to document what they built, what they survived, what they invented. I need to write reports that say this species is alive instead of this species will die." "You've never written a report like that?" "No." "Do you know how?" "No, but I refuse to not know." It was not a brave thing to say. It was an echo. I was borrowing their refusal, the refusal of these humans, these impossible people who had survived an asteroid and rebuilt the soil and packed surgical textbooks instead of food, and taken down surveillance drones with salvaged parts and broadcast their existence to a galaxy that had tried to erase them. I was borrowing the only thing they seemed to have in unlimited supply, and I was not sure I had earned it. But Essie nodded as though I had said something sufficient. "Then you'd better learn fast," she said, "because the Bureau is sending ships, and they're not coming to count the living." The Boundary Enforcement Rapid Response Unit arrived in the Sol system on my 11th day on the surface. 3 ships, a signal suppression cruiser and 2 escort frigates. Standard configuration for a containment operation, enough force to establish orbital dominance, neutralize a communications array, and ensure a world goes quiet without the political complications of a full military deployment. They were fast. The Bureau had scrambled them within hours of the original transmission, and they had made the transit at maximum sustainable speed, which told me the Bureau considered this an existential priority. The rapid response units are expensive to deploy. You don't spend that kind of operational capital on a signal fabrication. From the surface, we could track them. Dio's antenna array, augmented by the relay network of 7 other settlements, was able to detect the ship's approach signatures at the edge of the system. He had been mapping Concord drive profiles for years, another product of his 9-year listening project, and he identified the class and configuration before they passed the outer planets. 3 ships, he said. Suppression cruiser, 2 escorts. They'll be in orbit in 14 hours. 14 hours. I stood in the communications container and did the math that I was built for. 3 ships in orbit meant total signal blackout within 20 minutes of arrival. The suppression cruiser carried broad-spectrum electromagnetic dampening arrays capable of neutralizing every transmitter on the planet simultaneously. The escorts were armed not heavily, but enough to destroy ground-based infrastructure from orbit if the dampening proved insufficient. The Bureau was not going to bomb the settlements. That would be politically untenable, especially with the original transmission already circulating across the Concord. But they would silence them, cut every signal, jam every frequency, and then, in the quiet that followed, they would begin the process of reclassification, framing the surviving humans as a managed recovery population under Bureau jurisdiction, subject to observation protocols that would effectively quarantine them from galactic contact for decades. They had done it before. I was sure of it now. The 144 discrepancies the surviving populations found and filed and forgotten, some of them, had probably been managed exactly this way. Silenced, quarantined, placed under Bureau observation that ensured they could never reach the galactic community to speak for themselves. A living extinction, not death, but disappearance. 14 hours, Essie said. What can we do in 14 hours? You can't fight 3 warships. I didn't ask if we could fight them. I asked what we could do. I thought about it. I thought about Torek Vashin's 40-page report, received and filed and forgotten. I thought about the 12 new signals still playing through the speakers. I thought about the Concord Assembly, currently in emergency session. debating the authenticity of data that was already independently verified by dozens of sources. "The data is already out," I said. "They can silence Sol 3, but they cannot recall the transmission. The information is in the network." Information without a source is easy to discredit. If they shut us down and no one can verify independently, then the Bureau's narrative wins by default. The fabrication story holds. The 14 worlds stay invisible. Essie looked at the star map. 15 points of light now, the original 14 plus the unknown 15th. 15 species, alive, broadcasting, waiting. "Then we don't try to outshout them," she said. "We give them something they can't unhear." She called a meeting, not of Millbrook alone, of the entire network. 112 settlements connected by the relay chain that had carried the original transmission, all convening simultaneously through audio links that crackled and dropped and came back because the equipment was held together with solder and persistence. I listened. For 3 hours I listened to humans talk to each other about what to do. It was not efficient. It was not organized. There were arguments, tangents, silences that stretched too long, voices that broke, voices that shouted. A woman from a settlement called New Mangalore spent 12 minutes describing the irrigation system her community had built and refusing to accept that it might be destroyed by ships she could not see. A man from a place called Bastogne Libre wept openly on the channel, and no one told him to stop. A child, I do not know how old, the voice was very young, asked if the aliens were coming to drop another rock, and the silence after that question lasted 30 seconds, which is an eternity on a channel with 112 participants. They decided. Not unanimously, not cleanly, with arguments and dissent and fear and a vote that Essie tallied by settlement and announced to the network in a voice that did not waver. They decided to do the only thing that could not be jammed. At dawn on my 12th day, 6 hours before the Suppression Fleet was due to reach orbit, I stood on the hillside above Millbrook and watched 412 people walk into their fields. Not to harvest, not to plant, not to work, to stand. The decision, relayed across the network overnight, was this. When the ships arrived, every settlement on the planet would move its entire population into the open. Into the fields, the clearings, the rebuilt town squares, the riverbanks. Every man, woman, and child. Visible from orbit. Visible to the optical sensors that the suppression cruiser would be using to assess the surface. They would not transmit. They would not resist. They would not hide. They would simply be there. "The Bureau's report says we're dead," Essie had told the network. "So we're going to stand where they can see us and be alive, every settlement and everyone. We are not a signal they can jam. We are not data they can delete. We are people standing in our fields, and if they want us to be extinct, they will have to look at us while they say it." It was the most terrifying thing I had ever witnessed, and I have been present at the certified deaths of 412 species. They stood in their fields, in every settlement on the planet. They stood in the places they had built, wearing the clothes they had made, holding the tools they had forged, surrounded by the crops they had grown in soil they had resurrected from sterility. They stood with their children. The children held drawings. Some of the drawings were of the sun, some were of houses, some were of aliens with 4 hands sitting on hills. In Millbrook, Marisol, the 9-year-old who thought I had beautiful hands, stood next to her mother in a wheat field and held up a drawing she had made that morning. It showed the planet round and green with a small figure on it waving at the sky. Under the figure, in careful letters, she had written, "We are here." I stood on the hillside above them and I wept. I am not given to emotional display. I am an analyst. But I stood above 412 people in a wheat field who were staring up at a sky that had already tried to kill them once, and they were not running, not hiding, not fighting, just standing there being alive as hard as they could. And I wept because I had spent 31 years measuring the distance between civilizations and their graves, and I had never once considered the possibility that the dead might simply refuse to lie down. The Suppression Fleet entered orbit at midday. I know this because Dio's equipment detected the orbital insertion, even though the fleet's signals were shielded. The drive signatures were unmistakable. 3 ships, standard suppression configuration, positioning themselves in a polar orbit that would give them full surface scanning capability within 2 rotations. The dampening field activated 20 minutes later. Every electromagnetic transmission from the surface went silent. The relay network died. The antenna array died. Dio's screens went dark, but the humans did not move. They stood in their fields in the sudden electronic silence, and they looked up, and they waited. What happened next I learned after the fact, from Concord Assembly records that were later made public during the inquiry. I am relaying it as accurately as I can, but I want to be clear. I was on the ground. I saw the sky. I did not see what was happening beyond it. The suppression cruiser's first action upon achieving orbit was to conduct a full optical survey of the surface. This was standard procedure before implementing containment protocols. Boundary enforcement required a visual assessment of the operational environment. The optical survey returned images of 57 million human beings standing in the open, looking up. The cruiser's commanding officer, a Kethali named Vorath Sen, later testified that he reviewed the survey images 3 times. He had been briefed that Sol 3 harbored a small number of survivors, possibly a few thousand, clustered in isolated locations. His operational plan was designed for a population of that scale. Jamming, containment, quarantine, standard protocols for a manageable remnant. The images showed 112 organized settlements, agricultural infrastructure spanning 3 continents, road networks, schools, granaries, communications relays, a civilization, and every member of that civilization standing outside, faces up, waiting. Commander Sane later testified, "I had been told this was a post-extinction remnant population. What I was looking at was a country. Countries cannot be contained by 3 ships. I contacted the Bureau for revised orders and was told to proceed with the original plan. I asked for clarification on how to suppress a planetary civilization with equipment designed for a camp. I was told to proceed. I asked a 3rd time. I was told to proceed or face court-martial. He proceeded, not with the suppression." Commander Sane opened his ship's optical feed to the Concord Assembly's emergency channel. He broadcast the survey images every field, every settlement, every face turned skyward directly to the legislative body that was, at that moment, debating whether the Millbrook transmission was a fabrication. His testimony continues. "I'm a boundary enforcement officer. I have served for 22 years. I have conducted 11 containment operations. I have never been asked to contain a civilization. The Bureau told me these people were dead. They are not dead. They are standing in wheat fields holding their children. I am not equipped to make that extinct, and if the Bureau wants it done, they can come here and look these people in the eyes and do it themselves. I will wait." He cut the transmission and held position. His 2 escort frigates, crewed by officers who had seen the same images, held position with him. The Bureau's Director of Species Trajectory, watching the assembly feed from Vara Prime, subsequently ordered a full military task force to Sol 3 to relieve Commander Sane and complete the containment. The Concord Assembly voted to block the deployment. The vote was not close. I will not describe the political aftermath in detail because politics is not my competence, and this is not a political story. It is a story about what lives and what dies and who decides. But I will say this, the inquiry lasted 11 months. The Bureau of Species Trajectory was suspended pending investigation. The locked reactive adaptation variable was discovered by an independent technical review and became the central exhibit in the case. The full discrepancy archive, all 144 reports, was made public. Torek Vashin's 40-page report on Irida 4 was read into the assembly record by a Velhari legislator who wept halfway through and had to be relieved by a colleague. 14 worlds were resurveyed, not by the Bureau, by independent teams, assembled from Concord member species scientific agencies, operating under assembly mandate with full transparency protocols. Of the 14 worlds the Bureau had never gone back to check, 11 had surviving populations, 11 species, still alive, still building, still refusing. 3 of the 14 were empty. I reviewed those reports carefully, looking for what had killed them. In 2 cases, the evidence suggested gradual population decline over decades, the delayed collapse I described earlier, where a species survives the initial event but cannot sustain recovery without external support. They had been alive when the discrepancy report was filed. They had died in the years after, waiting for help that never came. The 3rd empty world showed no evidence of decline. The settlements were intact, the infrastructure maintained, the fields still planted, but the people were gone. Not dead gone. No remains, no signs of violence, no evidence of disease or famine. They had simply, at some point in the preceding decades, departed. Where they went, the survey team could not determine. The leading theory was voluntary migration. They had built a ship or ships and left. But no one knew for certain, and the silence of that empty, maintained world was the loudest thing in the entire investigation. They had kept the lights on for whoever came next. The 15th world, the one that wasn't on the Bureau's list, the signal Dio had detected from coordinates that matched no known classification, turned out to be a species the Bureau had never catalogued at all. Pre-industrial, no space capability, no previous contact with the Concorde. They had developed radio frequency communication independently, and when the Millbrook transmission reached their world, they had recognized it as artificial and responded. They were not a dead species reawakening. They were a living species that the Concorde's observational apparatus had simply never noticed. The galaxy was larger than the Bureau's filing system. This should not have been a revelation, but it was. I resigned from the Bureau on the day the suspension was announced. Not because I was forced to. I was not implicated in the institutional suppression, only in the methodology I had faithfully applied. I resigned because I could not look at my credentials and see anything but a line of 412 closed files, each one a world I had pronounced dead. I thought about returning to Vara Prime, finding a new position, starting over in a different capacity, perhaps in the Reclassification division that was being established to review every extinction report in the Bureau's 3-century history. Instead, I went to the first world on the list. It was called Etheris 7 in the Concorde's designation system. The surviving population, approximately 200,000 individuals of a species called the Merothi, called it Vayin, which in their language means something that does not translate directly, but approximates to the place where we chose to remain. I arrived as part of the independent survey team, but I stayed after the team left. I had told Essie I would learn to write reports that said this species is alive, and I had not yet learned, and the only way to learn was to do it. The Merothi had been classified as extinct 47 years ago following an atmospheric destabilization event that the Concorde had characterized as natural. The discrepancy report, filed 12 years later by a verification surveyor whose name I will not record because she is still alive and has asked for privacy, noted a surviving population of approximately 300,000. The report was filed, stamped, and archived. No action taken. In the 35 years since, the Merothi population had declined from 300,000 to 200,000. Not catastrophically, slowly, incrementally, through treatable diseases, preventable injuries, and nutritional deficiencies that any standard Concorde medical shipment could have addressed. They were dying one by one of curable things because a filing cabinet on Vara Prime said they were already dead. I sat with a Merothi elder named Thessin on the first day and tried to explain what I was doing there. I told her I was an analyst, that I had come to document their survival, that my documentation would be submitted to the Concorde Assembly as part of the reclassification process. She listened. She was patient. When I finished, she asked, "Are you the one who wrote the report?" "Not yours, but I wrote others." "How many?" 412. She processed this number with a stillness that I recognized from Essie. Not shock, but confirmation. "And now you want to write a different kind," she said. "Yes." "Why?" I could have given her the professional answer: methodology revision, institutional reform, corrected data. I could have given her the moral answer: guilt, responsibility, the weight of what I had done and failed to do. Instead, I told her the truth. Because a 9-year-old girl drew a picture of me sitting on a hill and wrote, "We are here," underneath it. And I have not been able to write an extinction report since. Thessin looked at me for a long time. "Come," she said, "I will show you what we built." I have been on Etheris 7 for 93 days as I write this. The report I am compiling is not like any document I have produced in 31 years of professional practice. It has no trajectory curve, no extinction probability, no terminal threshold calculation. It does not predict when the Merothi will die, because predicting death is no longer my function. Instead, it documents what they have done. It documents the atmospheric scrubbers they built from volcanic mineral deposits and hand-forged filtration membranes. It documents the subsurface farming chambers where they grow nutrient-dense algae cultures in geothermal heated water. It documents the school where children learn the old songs and the new chemistry simultaneously, because Thesson insists that a species that remembers only how to survive is already halfway to extinction, and a species that remembers only how to sing is the other half, and both halves need each other. It documents the names. Every Merothi who has died in 47 years of supposed extinction. Thesson keeps them not on a wall, like Acey's settlement, but in a spoken tradition. She recites them every evening, the full list, from the first death after the atmospheric destabilization to the most recent. It takes her 2 hours. She's been doing it every evening for 31 years. She says she will stop when someone else starts. I am learning to write in a tense I have never used. Every report I have ever written has been in the past tense or the terminal future. The species exhibited, the population will decline, the extinction threshold was reached, the language of closure, the grammar of endings. The report I am writing now is in the present tense. The Merothi cultivate, the Merothi build, the Merothi teach, the Merothi remember, the Merothi live. It is the most difficult writing I have ever done. Not because the data is complex, it is straightforward, almost painfully so. A population count, a resource inventory, a list of functional infrastructure. The difficulty is in the orientation. Every instinct I have, every reflex trained into me by 3 decades of professional practice, reaches for the ending. I catch myself calculating the nutritional deficit that will compound over the next decade, the genetic diversity bottleneck that will become critical in 3 generations, the atmospheric degradation rate that will require intervention within 20 years. I know these numbers. They are real. They are accurate. And they are, for the first time in my career, not the point. The point is that the Merothi are alive, and their being alive is not a condition to be assessed but a fact to be reported. Not measured against a timeline, not plotted on a curve, not weighed against the resources it would cost to sustain them. Alive, present tense, no trajectory, no terminal threshold. Just a species on a world, building what they need to build, solving what they need to solve, refusing what they need to refuse. I think about the locked variable, the reactive adaptation coefficient, set to 0 on the Bureau's first day of operation. Someone, 300 years ago, had decided that no species would ever invent its way out of extinction, and had encoded that decision into the mathematics that governed the life and death of worlds. And for 3 centuries the models had confirmed the assumption not because it was true, but because the assumption determined the response, and the response ensured the outcome. Species classified as terminal received no help. Species that received no help died. Species that died confirmed the model. A perfect circle. A machine for making death look like destiny. And outside the circle, in the dark, on worlds the machine had written off people built. People planted. People taught their children songs and wrote recovery protocols by candlelight and packed surgical textbooks instead of food, and stood in wheat fields looking up at a sky that had tried to kill them and refused to lie down. The machine could not see them because the machine was not looking, and the machine was not looking because the machine had decided before it ever opened its eyes that there was nothing to see. I was the machine's best eye. For 31 years I was the lens through which the galaxy looked at dying worlds and saw exactly what it expected. And now I am sitting on a world that was supposed to be empty, writing a report in the present tense, and the thing I feel is not guilt. Guilt would be more comfortable, more narratively satisfying, a clean wound I could tend and eventually heal. What I feel is vertigo. The vertigo of a person who has spent their entire life looking through a telescope pointed at the ground and has just, for the first time, tipped it toward the sky. I received a communication from SC Ajay this morning. Sol 3 has been formally reclassified as a living world. The Concord Assembly has allocated a humanitarian aid package, medical supplies, atmospheric monitoring equipment, genetic diversity support, the standard suite that triage-prioritized species receive. She tells me they accepted the medical supplies and the monitoring equipment. They declined the genetic diversity support. Their population geneticist, a woman named Dr. Lin Shuyi, who was a graduate student when the asteroid hit and taught herself population genetics from a textbook she found in a collapsed library, conducted her own assessment and determined that the current population's genetic diversity is sufficient for long-term viability. She was apparently very polite about it. SE also tells me that Dio has been appointed Sol 3's first representative to the Concord Assembly. He did not want the position. He wanted to stay at his communications console monitoring frequencies. SE told him that monitoring was listening and diplomacy was talking, and he had been doing both for 9 years, so he might as well do it in a room where people could hear him. He accepted. His first act as representative was to introduce a motion requiring the Concord to survey every world in its records that had been classified as extinct without independent verification. The motion was seconded by Commander Vorath Sane, who had been court-martialed for insubordination, acquitted on grounds of moral necessity, and subsequently elected to the Assembly by the Kethley Civic Union on a platform consisting of a single sentence: "I will not help make people extinct." The motion passed. The surveys are underway. It will take years, decades possibly. There are over 2,000 extinct classified worlds in the Bureau's records, and each one must be independently assessed. I will not be conducting any of them. My days of surveying worlds to determine whether their inhabitants are alive or dead are over. I am not qualified for that work anymore. I am not qualified because I now understand that the question itself, is this species alive or dead, is the wrong question. It is a question designed to produce a binary answer, and life is not binary. Life is a woman packing a surgical textbook. Life is a man growing fungi in ash. Life is a child drawing the sun she hasn't seen. Life is an elder reciting names for 2 hours every evening because someone has to remember, and she has decided it will be her. Life is not a state to be classified. It is a verb, continuous, present tense, refused. I will finish the Marothi report this week. It will be submitted to the Concord Assembly as part of the reclassification process, and it will be the first species viability assessment in the Bureau's history, or what remains of it that contains no extinction projection. When I am done, I will go to the next world. There are 11 confirmed survivors, plus the 15th world that was never catalogued, plus however many more the new surveys will find. Each one needs a report. Not a death certificate, a birth certificate. A document that says this species exists, this is what they built, this is who they are, this is what they need. I have written 412 extinction reports. This will be my first survival report. I do not know how many more I will write. That depends on how many worlds the surveys find and how long it takes, and whether the Concord's institutional willingness to look at what it has ignored can outlast the institutional reflex to look away. I am not optimistic. I am an analyst. Optimism is not my professional equipment, but I think about Marisol's drawing, the round green planet, the small figure waving, the careful letters, "We are here." And I think about the 12 signals that came from the dark when the Millbrook transmission went out. 12 species, sitting in silence, who heard a voice and answered. Not with weapons, not with demands, not with rage, with a pulse, a data set, a song, whatever they had. Sent into the dark because someone had finally spoken and the silence was no longer bearable. 15 species that the galaxy declared dead. 15 species that refused the declaration. 15 species that are, right now, as I write this, alive and building and teaching and remembering and standing in their fields looking up. And somewhere in the archive of the former Bureau of Species Trajectory, in a filing cabinet on Vara Prime that no one has opened in 300 years, there may be more. Hundreds more. Species that the galaxy killed and forgot, who survived the killing and are waiting in the dark for someone to look. I cannot find them all. I cannot save them all. Some of them are already gone, the delayed death, the quiet ending, the extinction that comes not from the blow, but from the silence that follows it. I know this. The numbers are what they are. But the numbers are not the only thing, because on a world called Sol 3, a woman packed a surgical textbook instead of food, and a man grew mushrooms in ash, and a child drew the sun, and 57 million people stood in their fields and looked up at the ships that had come to erase them and said, "We are here, we are here, we are here," and the galaxy heard them. And 300 years of closed files began to open. I do not write endings anymore. I write what is. Report 001-S. Analyst Salith Marin Vashari. Independent assessment. Species, Marothi. World, Vayan. Conquer designation Etheris 7. Status alive. Report 002-S, pending. World, Sol 3. Earth. Species, Homo sapiens. Status, alive. Report 003-S through 015-S, pending. Status to be determined. But I already know the answer. I always knew the answer. I just had to learn the right question.